My husband called me a disgrace in front of all of his friends present at the Riverside Country Club and handed me for the dinner. The dinner I didn't even know was happening until 3 hours before. Richard stood up, adjusted his Rolex, and said those words that would replay in my mind for weeks: "A woman like you should be grateful I bothered to rescue you from that farm town nobody." Then he walked out with Victoria Chin, his business partner, leaving me sitting there with strangers staring and whispering. The waiter brought the check on a silver tray and everyone suddenly needed to leave. Hello everyone, before we continue, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel, and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. This morning my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with messages from people I barely knew. Screenshots of social media posts. Photos from that night. Comments calling me pathetic, a gold digger who got what she deserved, a country bumpkin trying to play dress up in a world that would never accept her. But here's what none of those people posting and laughing knew: I had spent 38 years raising Richard's children, managing his household, and playing the perfect wife while he built his commercial real estate empire. I gave up my nursing career, my independence, my identity. And on my 60th birthday, he decided I was disposable. The whole thing started 6 months earlier when Richard made partner at Westridge Development Group. Suddenly our comfortable but modest life wasn't enough anymore. He joined the country club, bought a Porsche, started wearing $1,000 suits and coming home smelling like perfume that wasn't mine. Our conversations went from planning family dinners to him lecturing me about not embarrassing him in front of important people. He hired a personal shopper to fix my wardrobe because my clothes were frumpy and outdated. He told our adult children I was having memory problems when I forgot the name of some investor's wife I'd never actually met. But that birthday dinner was something different. That was calculated cruelty designed to break me completely. Richard had spent weeks telling me we have a quiet dinner, just the two of us, maybe our daughter Jessica and her kids. He knew I hated being the center of attention, hated fancy restaurants where I didn't know which fork to use. Then on my birthday morning, he texted me, "Dinner tonight at the club. 8 o'clock. Wear something appropriate for once. Don't embarrass me. No happy birthday. No love." Just orders from a man who'd forgotten I was his wife and not his employee. I remember standing in our walk-in closet that afternoon, surrounded by clothes his personal shopper had chosen, feeling completely lost. Nothing felt like me. Everything was designed to make me blend into Richard's new world, to make me invisible and acceptable. I found one dress in the back, a simple navy blue one I'd bought myself 2 years ago for Jessica's college graduation. It was modest, classic, nothing flashy. I thought it would be safe. I had no idea Richard had invited his entire investor group, their wives, his business partners, and specifically told them it was a networking dinner with entertainment. I was the entertainment. When I arrived at the country club that night, walking through those massive oak doors, I saw the private dining room filled with strangers. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, servers in tuxedos, and Richard standing at the head of the table laughing with Victoria Chin like I didn't exist. He didn't greet me, didn't pull out my chair, didn't introduce me to anyone. I stood there for 5 minutes before someone's wife took pity and pointed me to a seat at the far end of the table, squeezed between two men who spent the entire evening discussing commercial property values across my plate. And that's when I knew my husband didn't just stop loving me. He'd started hating me. The dinner itself was torture disguised as celebration. Course after course of food I couldn't identify, wine I didn't drink, conversations about yacht clubs and European vacations and exclusive resorts I'd never see. Richard gave a speech about his success, his vision, his brilliant business strategies, and never mentioned my name once. When someone finally asked about the birthday girl, he waved dismissively in my direction and said, "Oh, that's just Dorothy. She's from Nebraska. We're working on polishing her up." The table laughed. Victoria Chin laughed loudest. And something inside me that had been bending for 38 years finally cracked. But I didn't break. Not yet. Not in front of them. What happened next changed everything. A woman named Margaret Sterling, wife of Richard's biggest investor, leaned over and whispered, "Honey, your husband ordered the most expensive items on the menu for everyone here. I've seen this before. He's setting you up for something." Before I could process her words, Richard stood up again, checked his phone, and announced he had an emergency business call. He kissed Victoria's hand, told everyone to enjoy themselves on Dorothy's generous hospitality, and walked out. That's when the waiter brought me the bill. $6,417. And everyone watched to see what the farm girl would do when she realized she'd been played. People always asked how Richard and I met, and he loved telling his version. The successful young developer who took a wrong turn in Nebraska, broke down in some nowhere town, and was rescued by a sweet farm girl working at the local diner. He made it sound like a fairy tale, like he was the prince who saved me from a life of poverty and cow manure. But that's not how it happened. The truth is I saved him that day, and he spent 38 years making me pay for witnessing his vulnerability. I was 22, fresh out of nursing school with a job offer in Omaha, when Richard's BMW overheated outside Hartley, population 3,000. He stumbled into Miller's Diner where I was saying goodbye to my parents, furious and helpless and completely out of his element. This was 1987, before cell phones, before GPS, in a part of America where strangers still helped each other without expecting anything back. My father, who'd been a mechanic before farming, offered to look at his car. Richard was dismissive, almost rude, insisting he needed a real mechanic, not some farmer playing with wrenches. But there was no other option. My father fixed his radiator, refused payment, and invited Richard to join us for dinner while the car cooled down. That's when Richard actually looked at me for the first time. What Richard never told people was that he talked for 3 hours that night about his dreams, his fears, his pressure from his wealthy family to succeed in real estate development. He told me his father called him weak, his brothers mocked his business ideas, and he felt like a failure at 25 with only a modest trust fund and lots of ambition. I listened. I encouraged him. I told him he could build something meaningful if he stayed focused and honest. He asked for my number, and I gave it to him thinking I'd never hear from him again. But he called every single day for 2 months. The courtship happened fast. Too fast, my mother warned. Richard would drive 5 hours from Chicago to see me on weekends, bringing flowers and talking about our future together. He said I was different from the shallow women in his world, that I was genuine and kind and exactly what he needed. He proposed after 4 months, and I said yes because I believed him when he said we were partners building a life together. My nursing career could wait, he promised. We'd start our family, get established, and then I could go back to work when I was ready. That was the first lie. Or maybe I wanted to believe it so badly I ignored the warning signs already appearing. We married in a small ceremony in Hartley with my family and a few of Richard's college friends. His parents didn't come. They sent a check for $5,000 and a note saying they hoped this phase would end quickly. Richard pretended it didn't hurt him, but I saw the shame in his eyes. That should have told me everything I needed to know about the man I'd just married. He was desperate for approval from people who would never give it freely, and eventually he'd start seeing me through their eyes. As the years passed and Richard's business grew, he slowly erased the story of how we really met. The farm town became nowhere Nebraska in his retellings. My father the mechanic became just some farmer. My nursing degree disappeared entirely. I became a waitress he'd rescued, then just a girl who worked at a diner, then finally just from Nebraska, as if that explained everything wrong with me. His parents died within 2 years of each other, leaving Richard substantial wealth, and suddenly we were moving into bigger houses, joining exclusive clubs, surrounding ourselves with people who measured worth in property portfolios and vacation homes. And I was expected to transform into someone worthy of that world. I tried. God knows I tried for 38 years. I raised Christopher and Jessica while Richard worked 18-hour days building Westridge development. I decorated 7 different houses, each one larger and emptier than the last. I hosted dinner parties for clients I'd never see again, smiled through charity galas for causes Richard chose to impress investors, learned which wine paired with which meal, and slowly disappeared into the role of Richard's acceptable wife. But it was never enough. No matter how hard I worked to fit into his world, I'd always be the farm girl from Nebraska who didn't belong. And Richard made sure I never forgot it. Speech balloon. If you're enjoying Dorothy's story so far, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Tell us in the comments. Your stories matter to us. Christopher was born 11 months after our wedding, and Richard hired a nanny before I'd even left the hospital. He said it was to help me recover, to make things easier, but really it was because he didn't want me getting too comfortable staying home full-time. The nanny was supposed to be temporary, just for a few months, but she stayed until Christopher was 3. By then Jessica had arrived, and there was a new nanny, and I started understanding that my job wasn't to raise our children myself but to manage the people Richard hired to raise them. That's when I first felt like an employee in my own home. The kids grew up watching their father treat me like a secretary who occasionally cooked dinner. Christopher learned to dismiss my opinions by age 7 because Richard would openly contradict me in front of him. When I'd say no to something, Christopher would ask his father, and Richard would say yes just to undermine me. Jessica was different, more sensitive to the household tension, but she learned to stay quiet and avoid conflict. By the time they were teenagers, I'd become the parent who enforced rules while Richard was the fun dad who swept in with expensive gifts and exciting plans that never included me. Now Christopher is 37, a commercial real estate attorney working at his father's firm, married to a woman named Stephanie who looks at me like I'm an embarrassing relic from Richard's past. They have 2 children I barely see because Stephanie claims my energy upsets their routine. What that really means is I don't fit the aesthetic of their Instagram perfect life. I buy the wrong toys, suggest the wrong activities, dress too plainly for their country club playdates. Christopher sides with Stephanie in everything, just like he watched his father do to me for decades. When Richard told them about the divorce, Christopher's first question was whether this would affect his position at the firm. Jessica is 35, works in marketing in Seattle, and hasn't visited in 3 years. She calls once a month with polite questions about my health and weather, but we both know she's just going through the motions of having a mother. When she was 16, she screamed at me that I was pathetic for staying with a man who clearly didn't love me, and asked why I didn't have more self-respect. I didn't have a good answer then. She stopped trying to connect with me after that, building her own life far away from the toxicity of ours. I don't blame her. I'd have run away too if I could have. After the birthday dinner disaster, I called both my children. Christopher's response was exactly what I expected. Dad says you're having some kind of breakdown, and embarrassed him at an important business dinner. Maybe you should talk to someone, Mom. Get some help. He didn't ask for my side of the story. He didn't ask if I was okay. He'd already decided I was the problem because that's what Richard told him, and Richard was never wrong in Christopher's world. When I tried to explain what actually happened, he cut me off and said he couldn't take sides in his parents' marital issues. Except he already had. Jessica listened to the whole story in silence. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, processing everything I was telling her about the humiliation, the bill, Richard leaving with Victoria Chin. When I finished, she said, "Mom, I love you, but I told you years ago this is who he is. Why are you surprised?" Her words hurt more than Christopher's dismissal because they were true. I'd spent decades making excuses for Richard's behavior, explaining away his cruelty as stress or ambition or the pressure of success. Jessica had seen through it all by age 16, and I'd been too proud or too scared to admit she was right. But then Jessica said something that changed everything. Do you want to finally leave him, or are you calling me to vent so you can feel better about staying? That question hit me like cold water. For 38 years, I'd complained to my children about their father's behavior while never actually changing anything. I'd made them witnesses to my misery while refusing to do anything about it. I taught them that love meant accepting disrespect, that marriage meant losing yourself completely, that mothers were supposed to silently endure humiliation. And now I had to decide if I was going to keep teaching them that lesson, or finally show them something different. I told Jessica I wanted to leave. For real this time. Not just talk about it, not just threaten it during arguments, but actually do it. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "I'll help you, Mom. But you have to promise me you won't change your mind when he apologizes or buys you something expensive or tells you he'll try harder. I can't watch you go back again." Her condition stung because it was based on decades of watching me break my own promises to myself. But she was right to demand it. I'd lost her trust by staying so long. Now I had to earn it back by finally leaving. Margaret Sterling found me in the country club parking lot that night, sitting in my car trying to figure out how to pay a $6,000 dinner bill on a credit card that Richard monitored. She knocked on my window gently, and when I looked up, she was holding an envelope. "I paid your bill," she said. "Don't argue with me about it. We need to talk, and you're going to want to hear what I have to say." I didn't know this woman, had barely exchanged 10 words with her during dinner, and now she was standing in the dark offering me a lifeline I didn't understand. Margaret was 68, elegant in a way that came from genuine confidence rather than expensive clothes. Her husband, Thomas Sterling, was Richard's biggest investor, the man who'd funded 3 of his major development projects over the past 2 years. She invited me to coffee the next morning at a small cafe 20 minutes from town, somewhere we wouldn't run into anyone from Richard's social circle. I almost didn't go. I almost convinced myself she was just being kind, paying off a pity case, and the smart thing would be to mail her a check and forget this whole nightmare. But something in her eyes when she'd whispered to me during dinner made me show up. She was already waiting when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and a manila folder. "I know what your husband is doing," Margaret said before I'd even sat down. "I know because I watched him do the same thing to his first wife, and to the business partner before Victoria Chin, and to every woman who's ever gotten close enough to see who he really is underneath the charm." My stomach dropped. Richard had a first wife. In 38 years of marriage, he'd never mentioned being married before. He'd told me I was his first everything, his only love, his fresh start. Margaret opened the folder and showed me newspaper clippings from 1983, 4 years before I met Richard. Wedding announcement for Richard Whitmore and Patricia and Donnelly, society wedding in Chicago, both families in attendance. Then divorce filing 2 years later, messy and public, with Patricia claiming emotional abuse, financial control, and systematic isolation from her family and friends. The divorce was settled quickly and quietly with a non-disclosure agreement. Patricia got $50,000 and disappeared from Chicago entirely. Richard's family's lawyers had made sure the whole thing stayed out of major papers. Only the society columns had covered it, and those were easy to make disappear with enough money. "Patricia lives in Denver now," Margaret continued. "She remarried, has a good life, but it took her years to recover from what Richard did to her. She was from a working-class Italian family, first-generation American, full scholarship to Northwestern where she met Richard." Sound familiar? Everything about the story sounded familiar. Richard had a type, women he considered beneath him socially, women he could mold and control, women who'd be grateful for his attention and wouldn't question his authority. I was just the next version of Patricia, the Nebraska farm girl he could rescue and remake. Margaret explained that she'd befriended Patricia years ago through a women's business network in Colorado. When Margaret met Richard through her husband's investment deals, Patricia recognized him immediately and warned Margaret to watch him carefully. Patricia told me Richard's pattern, Margaret said. He marries women he thinks won't challenge him, builds them into the perfect corporate wife, then discards them when they start aging or developing their own opinions. He's already setting you up for the discard phase. That birthday dinner was his opening move. He's going to make you look unstable, incompetent, maybe even mentally ill. Then he'll divorce you, paint himself as the long-suffering husband who tried everything, and walk away with his reputation intact. The evidence was all there in Margaret's folder. Photos of Richard with Victoria Chin from the past 8 months at restaurants, hotels, business conferences. Text message screenshots that Margaret's private investigator had obtained showing Richard discussing the Dorothy problem with his lawyer. Plans to document my supposed memory issues, my social awkwardness, my inability to function in his professional world. A strategy to claim I'd become a liability to his business reputation, that I needed professional help he tried to get me, that the marriage had become untenable for his career. He was going to make me the villain of our divorce story. But here's what Richard doesn't know, Margaret said, sliding another document across the table. My husband Thomas has been documenting every questionable financial dealing Richard has made over the past 3 years. Inflated appraisals, kickbacks to city officials for zoning approvals, shell companies moving money offshore to avoid taxes. Thomas doesn't trust Richard anymore, and he's been gathering evidence in case he needs to protect himself legally. If you're smart, Dorothy, you'll use this information to protect yourself first. She was offering me weapons. After decades of being defenseless in my own marriage, someone was finally giving me the tools to fight back. Speech balloon Dorothy is about to discover just how deep Richard's deception goes. Before we continue, drop a flexed biceps in the comments if you think she should fight back, or share your own story of finding unexpected allies. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Margaret connected me with a forensic accountant named Lisa Chin, no relation to Victoria despite the coincidence of the last name. Lisa specialized in uncovering hidden assets in divorce cases, particularly for women who'd been financially controlled by their spouses. She was 43, sharp as broken glass, and had a reputation for destroying men who tried to cheat their wives out of fair settlements. Her fee was $5,000 up front, which I didn't have, but Margaret covered it with one condition: I had to promise to see this through and not back down when Richard turned on the charm or threats. Lisa's office was small and practical, nothing like the expensive law firms Richard dealt with. She sat me down with tea and a box of tissues, which immediately made me suspicious of how bad this was going to be. First thing, Lisa said, I need you to understand that everything I find belongs to both of you under Illinois marital property law. Doesn't matter whose name is on the accounts or who earned the money. 38 years of marriage means you're entitled to half of everything accumulated during the marriage. But we need to find it all before Richard can hide it. For the next week, I became a detective in my own home. While Richard was at work, I photographed every document in his home office, forwarded myself emails from his computer when he left it unlocked, collected bank statements and investment portfolios and tax returns from the past 10 years. I felt guilty at first, like I was betraying his privacy, which is absurd considering what he'd been doing to me. But years of being trained to prioritize his comfort over my own safety made me hesitate even when gathering evidence of his betrayal. What Lisa found was staggering. Richard had been systematically hiding money for at least 5 years, probably longer. He had offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands holding over $2 million. He had a separate investment portfolio in his brother's name that he controlled, worth another $3 million. He owned partial interest in 4 commercial properties through shell corporations that didn't appear on our joint tax returns. He'd been taking cash advances on credit cards I didn't know existed and depositing them in accounts I couldn't access. The total hidden assets were approximately $8 million, separate from the legitimate business and property we owned jointly. But the most disturbing discovery was a document Lisa found buried in old files, a post-nuptial agreement Richard had drafted 6 years ago but never asked me to sign. The agreement stated that in the event of divorce, I would receive only $200,000 total settlement, no alimony, and would be required to sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing me from discussing our marriage or his business dealings. It included a clause claiming I'd developed psychological issues making me unreliable and potentially damaging to his professional reputation. He'd been planning this for years. The post-nuptial agreement was accompanied by notes from Richard's attorney discussing strategy. They decided not to ask me to sign it yet because I might refuse or become suspicious. Instead, they were building a case documenting my supposed mental deterioration, planning to argue later that I'd agreed to the terms verbally but my memory issues prevented me from recalling the agreement. They were literally going to gaslight me in court, claiming I'd consented to my own financial destruction but couldn't remember because I was mentally unfit. Lisa also found evidence of Richard's affair with Victoria Chen going back 18 months, not 6 months like I'd suspected. Hotel receipts, jewelry purchases, a lease on a condo in downtown Chicago where they'd been meeting 3 times a week. He'd spent over $400,000 on Victoria and their affair, all while telling me we needed to cut back on household expenses because business was tight. He'd made me feel guilty for buying new shoes while spending thousands on his mistress. The cruelty was calculated and deliberate. The final piece of evidence changed everything. Lisa discovered that Richard had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy on me 3 months ago, naming himself as sole beneficiary. When she found it, she went completely silent for a full minute before looking at me with fear in her eyes. "Dorothy," she said carefully, "I need you to be very careful right now. This policy, combined with his documented plans to make you look mentally unstable, and the fact that he's been increasing your anxiety medication dosage without your knowledge." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. I'd been taking the same anxiety medication for 15 years, a low dose prescribed after Jessica left for college and I struggled with empty nest syndrome. Richard always picked up my prescriptions from the pharmacy because he passed it on his way home from work. He'd bring them to me with water and remind me to take them every night before bed. I thought he was being helpful, caring, the devoted husband making sure his wife stayed healthy. Lisa's discovery made me look at those pills differently. She'd found pharmacy records showing Richard had been getting stronger dosages filled every 6 months, telling the pharmacist I'd lost my pills and needed emergency refills. I took the bottle from my nightstand to a pharmacist Lisa recommended, someone who had no connection to Richard. The pharmacist tested one of the pills and confirmed what Lisa suspected. What I thought was my regular 5 mg dose was actually 25 mg, 5 times stronger than what my doctor had prescribed. At that dosage, taken nightly for however long Richard had been switching them, I'd be experiencing memory problems, confusion, increased anxiety, difficulty concentrating. All the symptoms Richard had been telling people I was developing naturally. He was poisoning me slowly and using the effects to justify his narrative about my mental decline. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My husband of 38 years had been systematically drugging me to make me appear mentally incompetent. Every time I'd forgotten someone's name at a business dinner, every time I'd seemed confused or disoriented at social events, every time I'd struggled to follow conversations or remember details, it wasn't my failing mind. It was Richard deliberately sabotaging my mental clarity to build his case against me. And everyone had believed him because who suspects a devoted husband of poisoning his wife? I stopped taking the pills immediately. Lisa insisted I go to a doctor and get blood work done, documentation of the medication levels in my system compared to what should have been there based on my prescription. The doctor was horrified. She filed a report with the medical board and told me bluntly that at these dosage levels, combined with the life insurance policy, I needed to consider that Richard might be planning something worse than divorce. She urged me to move out of the house immediately, to stay somewhere Richard couldn't access my food or medications. But I couldn't leave yet. If I moved out, Richard would know I was onto him, and he'd start destroying evidence and hiding assets faster than Lisa could track them. I had to stay, pretend everything was normal, keep taking the pills where he could see me but actually disposing of them. For 2 weeks, I lived in that house playing the confused, medicated wife while secretly gathering evidence against the man who was trying to destroy me. It was the most terrifying 2 weeks of my life, smiling at him across the breakfast table knowing he was actively planning my financial ruin or possibly worse. The clarity that came from being off those pills was remarkable. Within days, my memory sharpened, my confusion lifted, my anxiety decreased. I realized how much of the past few years had been lived in a fog Richard created. Important conversations I couldn't recall, social events where I'd embarrassed myself by forgetting key details, business dinners where I'd seemed disconnected and strange, all of it had been Richard's manipulation using medication to create the reality he wanted. I'd been losing myself slowly, and he'd been standing by encouraging my decline while telling everyone how worried he was about me. Lisa used the medication evidence to accelerate our legal strategy. We now had proof of elder abuse, fraudulent prescription acquisition, and attempted medical manipulation that could support criminal charges, not just divorce proceedings. But Lisa warned me that going public with these accusations would turn this from a messy divorce into a full-scale war. Richard would fight back with every resource he had. His lawyers would claim I was paranoid, that I'd confused my medications myself, that this was more evidence of my mental instability. They'd try to paint me as a vindictive wife making outrageous accusations to extort money from her successful husband. But here's what they won't expect, Lisa said, showing me the complete evidence package she'd assembled. We have pharmacy records, prescription histories, blood work results, and testimony from multiple medical professionals. We have the post-nuptial agreement he drafted without your knowledge, the hidden assets, the affair, the life insurance policy, and Margaret's husband's evidence of financial fraud. We're not making accusations. We're documenting felonies. When we're ready to file, we're not just filing for divorce. We're going to the state attorney's office with a criminal complaint. And Richard's perfect reputation is going to collapse before he knows what hit him. Speech balloon. This story is getting intense. Are you Team Dorothy all the way? Comment below with your thoughts, and if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Share this video with anyone who's ever felt trapped in a toxic relationship. Part 7 is where everything changes. You won't want to miss it. Lisa connected me with a private investigator named Marcus Webb who specialized in tracking down witnesses for divorce cases. His first assignment was finding Patricia and Donnelly, Richard's first wife that I'd only learned about weeks ago. Margaret had lost touch with Patricia over the years and only had an old Denver address. Marcus found her in 3 days. She was Patricia and Morrison now, remarried for 26 years to a high school teacher, living in Boulder, working as a librarian. She'd built a quiet, normal life far away from Chicago and Richard's world. When Marcus called to ask if she'd speak with me, she said yes immediately. Patricia and I met at a coffee shop in Boulder. I'd flown out alone, telling Richard the first was visiting Jessica in Seattle, which he barely acknowledged. Patricia was 64, gray-haired and comfortable in jeans and a sweater, nothing like the polished society wife I'd seen in her wedding photo from 1983. She hugged me when we met like we were old friends, and I realized we were in a terrible way. We were both women who'd loved Richard Whitmore and learned too late what he really was underneath the charm. We'd both paid the price for believing his promises. I knew he'd do this to someone else, Patricia said after we'd settled at a corner table. Men like Richard don't change. They just get better at hiding who they are. She told me her story, and it was like listening to my own life from an alternate timeline. Richard had swept her off her feet in college, made her feel chosen and special, isolated her from family and friends who didn't understand their connection, controlled every aspect of her life while calling it love. By the time she realized she was trapped in an abusive marriage, she had no money, no support system, and no idea how to escape. The final straw for me was when I got pregnant, Patricia said quietly. I was so happy. I thought maybe a baby would make Richard soften, would give us something real to focus on instead of his constant criticism and control. But when I told him, he said I needed to terminate the pregnancy because we weren't ready financially. Then I found out he'd already scheduled the abortion without asking me. He talked to his lawyer, his accountant, his mother, everyone except me about my own pregnancy. I refused to go, and that's when he showed me who he really was. Richard had threatened her. Told her if she had the baby, he'd divorce her and make sure she got nothing. He claimed she trapped him with the pregnancy, that she was mentally unstable, that she'd been unfaithful and the child might not be his. He had his lawyer draft documents Patricia would have to sign if she continued the pregnancy, documents that would waive all her rights to marital property and give Richard full custody. She was 24 years old, completely financially dependent on him, terrified and alone. She had the abortion. The marriage ended 6 months later when Patricia tried to kill herself. Richard divorced her while she was still in psychiatric care. The $50,000 settlement felt like so much money at the time, Patricia said. I was just grateful to escape with my life. I didn't understand how much I was entitled to, how much he'd manipulated and stolen from me. I signed the non-disclosure agreement because his lawyers said if I didn't, they'd pursue legal action claiming I'd been unfaithful and owed Richard money for the abortion and therapy. I was so broken I believed them. It took me 10 years of therapy and meeting my husband Paul to understand what Richard had done to me was abuse, not love gone wrong. Patricia agreed to provide testimony for my case, despite the non-disclosure agreement. Those agreements don't hold up when there's evidence of criminal activity, she explained. Lisa had already confirmed this with our lawyers. Patricia's testimony about Richard's pattern of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and control would establish that his treatment of me wasn't isolated but a documented pattern spanning 40 years and multiple relationships. More importantly, Patricia remembered details about Richard's business practices from their marriage, including questionable dealings with his father's real estate company that might prove current financial crimes had deep roots. Before I left Boulder, Patricia gave me a piece of advice that changed how I saw everything. Stop thinking of yourself as Richard's victim, she said. You are. I am. But if you go into this seeing yourself only as what he did to you, you'll never fully escape him. You need to remember who you were before Richard, and figure out who you want to be after him. That's the only way you'll survive what's coming. Because when you file against him, Dorothy, he's going to try to destroy you completely. That's what men like him do when they lose control. I flew home that night thinking about 22-year-old Dorothy from Hartley, Nebraska, who'd just graduated nursing school with a job offer in Omaha. She was confident, capable, excited about her future. She had dreams bigger than being somebody's wife, plans that didn't include disappearing into another person's ambitions. Somewhere over 38 years, I'd forgotten that woman existed. Richard had convinced me I was nothing without him, that my only value came from being his wife, that I should be grateful he'd rescued me from my small-town life. But he hadn't rescued me. He'd kidnapped me from my own future. Lisa and our attorney, a fierce woman named Caroline Mendez who'd built her career on high-profile divorces, decided we needed to file quickly before Richard suspected anything. The evidence package was complete: financial fraud, elder abuse, adultery, hidden assets, medication tampering. We had Patricia's testimony, Margaret's husband's documentation of business crimes, pharmacy records, blood work results, private investigator reports, and photographs of Richard with Victoria Chin. We had 38 years of financial records showing the systematic way Richard had controlled and hidden money. We had enough evidence to end not just our marriage but possibly Richard's freedom. Caroline filed on a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. By 9:30, emergency motions had been filed to freeze all of Richard's accounts, prevent him from accessing our joint assets, and block him from the house pending abuse allegations. By 10 o'clock, the state attorney's office had received our criminal complaint regarding medication tampering and elder abuse, with copies of all supporting evidence. By 11 o'clock, Richard's attorney was calling Caroline's office in a panic, and by noon, Richard himself was standing in our driveway as police officers escorted him away from the property he could no longer enter legally. I watched from the living room window as Richard argued with the officers, his face red with rage, pointing at the house like he could will himself back inside through sheer entitlement. He was wearing one of his expensive suits, probably had been in a meeting with investors when his lawyer reached him with the news. For 38 years, I'd feared Richard's anger, walked on eggshells to avoid triggering his criticism, made myself smaller to accommodate his ego. Now I watched him completely powerless, locked out of his own home by legal orders I'd put in motion, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Victoria Chin pulled up in her Mercedes 10 minutes later. I watched her get out of the car and approach Richard, watched him turn his fury on her, blaming her somehow for this disaster even though she clearly had no idea what was happening. They argued on the lawn while the police officers stood by watching, and I realized Richard would never take responsibility for his own actions. He'd blame me for overreacting, Victoria for being careless, his lawyers for not protecting him, anyone but himself for the consequences of his choices. That's who he'd always been. I'd just been too conditioned to see it clearly. The first 24 hours after filing were chaos orchestrated carefully by Caroline and Lisa. Every asset Richard thought he controlled was frozen or seized pending investigation. The offshore accounts, the shell corporations, the properties in his brother's name, all of it locked down before he could move anything. Caroline had coordinated with Margaret's husband Thomas, who'd simultaneously filed his own legal action to recover investments based on evidence of Richard's financial fraud. Thomas's lawsuit gave prosecutors additional grounds to investigate Richard's business dealings going back a decade. The media picked up the story by evening. Not because of our divorce, wealthy real estate developers divorce all the time, but because the criminal complaints included accusations of elder abuse and financial fraud involving other victims. A reporter had gotten hold of court documents and called Caroline for comment. She gave a carefully worded statement about systemic abuse and financial crimes, mentioning Patricia's similar experience 40 years ago. By the 10 o'clock news, Richard's face was on television with the headline "Prominent Developer Accused of Decades-Long Pattern of Abuse and Fraud." Christopher called at 11:30 that night, furious. "What have you done to Dad?" he shouted before I could even say hello. "Do you have any idea what you've done to his reputation? To the firm? To my career? This is insane, Mom. You've lost your mind." I let him yell for 2 full minutes, all the accusations and insults he'd learned from Richard over 37 years. When he finally stopped for breath, I said calmly, "Your father has been drugging me to make me appear mentally incompetent so he could divorce me without proper settlement. Would you like to see the medical records?" Silence. Then he hung up. Jessica called 5 minutes later. She'd seen the news, had been trying to reach me for hours. "Mom," she said, her voice shaking, "please tell me you're safe. Please tell me you're somewhere he can't get to you." I assured her I was fine, that police were monitoring the house, that Caroline had arranged for private security given the life insurance policy and medication evidence suggesting potential danger beyond financial abuse. Jessica started crying, apologizing for all the years she'd been angry at me for staying, for not understanding how trapped I'd been. "I'm coming home," she said. "I'm getting on a plane tomorrow. You're not going through this alone." The reality of what I'd set in motion hit me around 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep. I'd just ended my marriage, potentially destroyed Richard's career, exposed him to criminal prosecution, and torn our family apart. Christopher would probably never forgive me. Richard's business partners would hate me for the scandal. Our social circle would take his side because that's what wealthy people do, protect their own. I'd be 60 years old, alone, and starting over with nothing but a legal battle ahead of me. For a moment, the fear almost paralyzed me. Then I remembered the woman I'd met in Boulder who'd survived Richard's cruelty and built a real life. If Patricia could do it at 24 with nothing, I could do it at 60 with evidence and allies. The week after filing was worse than I'd imagined. Richard's attorneys launched a coordinated media campaign painting me as a vindictive wife who'd fabricated abuse allegations to extort money from her successful husband. They leaked carefully edited financial documents suggesting I'd been spending excessively on personal expenses while Richard worked to support our lifestyle. They found old acquaintances from the country club willing to give interviews about my erratic behavior and obvious mental decline at social events. They even got Christopher to make a statement supporting his father and expressing concern about my psychological state. The local society pages ran articles with headlines like "Socialite's Shocking Allegations" and "Developer's Wife Claims Abuse in Bitter Divorce." The stories focused on my Nebraska farm background, my lack of college degree, conveniently forgetting I'd been accepted to nursing school, and my 38 years as a homemaker who'd never worked. They made it sound like I'd been a kept woman living off Richard's success, now trying to destroy him because he'd finally seen through my act. The comments sections were vicious. People called me a gold digger, a liar, a crazy old woman jealous of her husband's success and younger mistress. But Caroline and Lisa had prepared for this. They'd held back the most damaging evidence during initial filing, waiting to see how Richard would respond. When his attorneys claimed I was mentally unstable and fabricating allegations, we released the pharmacy records showing the medication tampering. When they suggested I was motivated by greed, we released evidence of the $8 million in hidden assets Richard had kept from me. When Christopher made his statement supporting his father, we released portions of the post-nuptial agreement Richard had drafted without my knowledge, showing his years-long plan to leave me with nothing. Patricia agreed to a television interview, her first time speaking publicly about her marriage to Richard despite the non-disclosure agreement. She sat calmly on camera and described the same pattern of control, isolation, and financial abuse I'd experienced, events that happened 40 years ago but sounded identical to my story. She showed the divorce settlement documents from 1985, the non-disclosure agreement Richard's family had forced her to sign, the medical records from her suicide attempt. "Richard Whitmore destroys women systematically," she told the interviewer. "Dorothy is just the latest victim, but she's the first one brave enough to fight back publicly." Margaret's husband Thomas gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal about Richard's business practices. He provided documentation of inflated property appraisals, kickbacks to city officials, and offshore accounts used to hide profits from investors and taxes. Thomas explained that he'd been quietly gathering evidence for 3 years, planning to distance himself from Richard's firm once he had enough proof to protect his own investments. "When I learned what Richard was doing to his wife," Thomas said, "I realized his business fraud and personal abuse were the same pattern. He takes advantage of anyone who trusts him." The narrative started shifting by the second week. News outlets began investigating Richard's business dealings more thoroughly, finding other investors who'd lost money, contractors who'd been cheated, former employees who'd been fired for questioning suspicious transactions. A business reporter discovered that Victoria Chen had been a junior associate at Richard's firm until 18 months ago, when she'd suddenly been promoted to partner despite having fewer credentials than several other candidates. The timeline matched exactly with when Richard's affair with her began. It became clear that Richard had been giving company resources and partnership status to his mistress while hiding assets from his wife. Then the state attorney's office announced formal charges: elder abuse, fraudulent prescription acquisition, identity theft for creating false prescription records, and pending investigation into financial crimes including money laundering and investor fraud. Richard was arrested at his office on a Thursday morning, let out in handcuffs past news cameras his own publicist had once courted. His lawyers immediately arranged bail, but the damage was done. Richard's carefully constructed image as a successful, respectable businessman had collapsed in 2 weeks. Everything he'd worked 40 years to build was gone because he'd underestimated the farm girl from Nebraska he'd been slowly destroying. Christopher called again, different this time. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. "In person. Not at the house. Somewhere neutral." We met at a park near his office. He looked terrible, exhausted, older somehow, like he'd aged years in 2 weeks. "Stephanie's leaving me," he said. taking the kids to her parents' house. She said she can't be associated with this scandal, that it's affecting her social reputation. She said she doesn't want to end up like you. Trapped and controlled. He laughed bitterly. I never realized I was turning into dad until my wife said she was afraid of becoming you. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. Whatever Christopher had done or said, he was still my son, and watching his marriage crumble because of his father's sins wasn't satisfying. I'm sorry you're learning this way who your father really is. I'm sorry you have to question everything you believed about your childhood, your family, your own marriage. But Christopher, you can make different choices now. You can look at what your father did to me, to Patricia, to every woman who trusted him, and decide to be different. That's the only good that can come from this. He nodded slowly, and I saw tears in his eyes for the first time since he was a child. Did he really drug you, Mom? The pills? I showed him the medical reports Caroline had provided me, the pharmacy records, the blood work comparing prescribed dosage to actual dosage. I watched my son realize his father had been poisoning his mother to steal her money, and something broke in his face. I defended him, Christopher whispered. I went on TV and said you were lying. How do I come back from that? I didn't have an answer. Some things can't be fixed, only survived. Speech balloon. The truth is finally coming out. What would you do in Dorothy's situation? Would you forgive Christopher? Drop your thoughts below and don't forget to like and share this video. We're almost at the end of Dorothy's incredible journey. Subscribe so you don't miss the powerful conclusion. The divorce settlement took 6 months to finalize, but the outcome was never really in question once the criminal charges were filed. Richard's attorneys tried to negotiate, offering increasing amounts to make everything go away quietly, but Caroline refused every offer. We're not negotiating, she told them. Your client committed crimes. We're documenting consequences. The final settlement gave me half of all marital assets, including the hidden accounts Richard thought I'd never find, the house, alimony of $15,000 monthly for the rest of Richard's life or until I remarried, and full legal fees paid by Richard's estate. The total value of my settlement was approximately $12 million. Richard had spent 40 years telling me I was worthless, that I contributed nothing, that I should be grateful he'd rescued me from my nobody life in Nebraska. Now he was legally obligated to pay me millions in recognition of the 38 years I'd spent building his home, raising his children, and playing the perfect wife while he built his empire on my invisible labor. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, especially Richard, whose own assets were so depleted by legal fees and fraud investigations that he'd be rebuilding his finances for years. Richard pleaded guilty to elder abuse and prescription fraud as part of a deal to avoid trial on the more serious financial crimes. He was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, 5 years probation, and mandatory therapy for abusive behavior. His real estate license was revoked permanently. Westridge Development dissolved, with partners scrambling to distance themselves from Richard's toxic reputation. Victoria Chin disappeared from Chicago entirely, her own career destroyed by association with Richard's crimes. Christopher resigned from what remained of his father's firm and started over at a small practice, slowly rebuilding his reputation and his marriage. It took a year, but Stephanie eventually came home. Jessica moved back to Chicago and we started rebuilding our relationship without Richard's toxicity between us. She introduced me to her girlfriend Emma, a relationship she'd been hiding for years because she didn't want to give Richard ammunition to criticize her choices. We had Sunday dinners at my new apartment. I'd sold the house, couldn't live in the place where Richard had poisoned me, and talked about everything I'd missed during the years of distance. She told me she'd been angry at me not for staying with Richard but for pretending the marriage was okay when everyone could see I was miserable. I just wanted you to admit the truth, she said. That would have been enough. I used part of my settlement to go back to school. At 61 years old, I enrolled in a nursing program to complete the career Richard had convinced me to abandon 38 years ago. The coursework was challenging, the technology completely different from what I'd learned in 1987, but I was determined. I'd spent 4 decades being Richard's wife, and now I wanted to remember who Dorothy was before she met him. The nursing instructors were encouraging, my classmates were respectful despite the age difference, and for the first time in decades I felt like I was building something that belonged only to me. Patricia and I stayed in touch, calling each other monthly to share updates on our separate healing journeys. She told me that speaking publicly about Richard had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for 40 years. I spent so long being ashamed that I'd let him destroy me, she said. Seeing you fight back helped me realize neither of us should be ashamed. He's the one who should carry that shame. We talked about maybe writing a book together, 2 women separated by 40 years telling parallel stories of the same predator. Maybe it would help other women see the patterns earlier, leave before decades were lost. Margaret became one of my closest friends. She invited me to join a women's business network she'd founded, a group specifically focused on helping older women restart careers or businesses after divorce. I met dozens of women with stories similar to mine, decades-long marriages to controlling men, financial abuse disguised as love, systematic destruction of identity and independence. We supported each other through divorces, custody battles, business ventures, and the slow process of remembering who we'd been before we disappeared into someone else's life. For the first time in my adult life, I had real friendships based on who I was, not who I was married to. On my 61st birthday, exactly 1 year after Richard had humiliated me at the Riverside Country Club, I threw myself a party. Not at an expensive restaurant with strangers watching, but at my apartment with Jessica, Emma, Margaret, Patricia who'd flown in from Boulder, Lisa, Caroline, and a few other women from Margaret's network. We ate pizza and drank wine and laughed about everything we'd survived. Jessica gave a toast to my mom, who taught me that it's never too late to save yourself. Everyone raised their glasses, and I realized I was surrounded by people who loved me for exactly who I was: farm girl from Nebraska, nursing student, survivor, fighter, friend. I thought about writing to Richard in prison, considered whether I owed him any final words after 38 years together. But what would I say? Thank you for showing me who you really were before you killed me financially or literally. I'm grateful you underestimated me enough to let me gather evidence. In the end, I decided Richard didn't deserve any more of my words or thoughts or energy. He'd taken 38 years. He wasn't getting another minute. The best revenge wasn't a letter or a confrontation. It was building a life so full and real that he became irrelevant to my story. On the night of my 61st birthday party, after everyone had gone home, I stood in my small apartment looking at photos on the wall. My nursing school acceptance letter from 1987. Pictures of Jessica and me laughing together. A photo Margaret had taken of Patricia and me in Boulder, 2 women who'd survived the same monster. My nursing student ID card from the program I'd just completed my first semester in. These were my accomplishments, my relationships, my identity. Not Richard's wife. Not anyone's shadow. Just Dorothy, 61 years old, starting over, finally free. I called my parents that night, both still alive and living in Hartley, Nebraska, still in the farmhouse where I'd grown up. I'm coming home for a visit, I told my mother. I want to see where I came from before Richard tried to make me forget. She cried happy tears and said they'd been waiting for me to come back to myself for 40 years. My father got on the phone and said simply, "Proud of you, Dorothy girl. Always knew you had steel in you. Just took a while to remember it." That's when I finally cried, not from sadness but from relief that the woman those people had raised was still here, battered but not broken. The last thing I did before going to sleep that night was write in the journal Lisa had encouraged me to keep throughout the divorce process. I wrote about the humiliation at the country club that had started everything, and how that moment of complete degradation had actually been my liberation. Richard thought he was destroying me that night, showing me and everyone else that I was worthless. Instead, he'd shown me I had nothing left to lose, and that's the most dangerous thing a woman can realize about herself. When you have nothing to protect, you become fearless. And fearless women are unstoppable. Speech Balloon, thank you so much for watching Dorothy's incredible journey from humiliation to empowerment. Her story reminds us that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, reclaim your life, and start over. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true life stories, and comment below telling us, what would you do with your second chance at life? Dorothy chose nursing school and freedom. What would you choose? Remember, you are never too old to save yourself. You are never too far gone to start over. And you are never alone. Thank you for being part of our community. We'll see you in the next story. Flexed Biceps Red Heart.